Hi everybody, it's Cassidy, Mimic of Modes here on Twitter, on Tumblr, on Reddit, and on Etsy. Anyway, I have a small but fantastic collection of historic clothing. Antique historic clothing, not pieces I've made. I don't actually have that much of that. A few of the pieces I bought myself at thrift shops and on eBay and Etsy, but most of it was actually very kindly given to me several years ago by a blogging friend, Natalie Ferguson, and I'll link to her down below. Unfortunately, I've never had the chance to do anything much with them, but I'm really excited to be able to share them with the world this way. My collection ranges from a late 18th century shift to a 1980s cocktail dress, with most of the pieces coming from the early 20th century. First, I thought I could show you this gorgeous Edwardian evening skirt. The bodice apparently didn't survive, or maybe it was sold separately at some point, but it's very delicate. I wouldn't want to put it on my dress form, and I also don't have a large enough space on the floor, let alone a table, to lay it out. However, I'm moving this winter, and I should have enough space to show it to you once I'm in my new place. Then I thought about this simple blue day dress from the same period, but I started to put it on the dress form, and it didn't fit. The one right behind me. I definitely need to get or make myself a very thin dress form to display some of my antique clothing. Actually, I made a pair of very small dress forms at my last job, the St. Lawrence County Historical Association, because we only had old store mannequins to display clothing on. And although store mannequins are a lot smaller than the average woman today, they're usually still much more robust than the very petite women whose clothing we still generally have. If I do decide to go that route, I'll be sure to do it on camera so you can all see how it's done and make them yourselves if you choose to. Back on topic, in the end, I decided to show you one of my favorite pieces from Natalie's collection, a silk taffeta day dress from 1866 or 1867. And I meant to have it dressed on the form behind me, but I did the middle section of this video before I did the beginning and end, and so I had already taken it off, and it's still kind of delicate, and I didn't really want to put it back on and stress it out some more. So instead, right now you can see the light blue linen late medieval kirtle that I'm working on. But let's take a good look at the 1866-1867 day dress, starting with the bodice.
Let's start by looking at the bodice, which you can see in the front has been messed with a little bit. First of all, we have a fairly deep V neckline with an attached lace collar. When we go to the back, you can see it's in two pieces. And this lace collar I will get back to in a bit, but it's not original. There's a center front closure with hooks and eyes, also not original. You can see if we get closer, it's done with a gray thread, which is going to be a great clue for us when we look at the rest of the bodice, because the original sewing is all done with a tan thread that blends in a little better with the brown silk. We've got two darts on either side, which is the norm for mid-19th century bodices, and you can see it's been opened up. Both of the darts have lines from stitching, and it's most likely the bottom of the front of the bodice has also been reshaped a little. Can't say exactly what it originally looked like, but I would bet there was a point to it. The bodice is trimmed with a silk braid, which has also been moved. When you're in close, you can see that it's been sewn on with a gray thread. Most likely it originally started around here and came at around the same angle and then up a little higher. You can still see some of the stitching line here and across to there. This is a style of trim that was very popular in the 1860s all the way up to about 1870, 1871. And it's a great way to accentuate the low shoulder line that was in style at the time. Here is the back. This point to the braid was probably not originally a point, but more of a line across the back of the shoulders. However, the side back seams are still original. You can't quite see it because the tan thread blends in so well, but they're sewn with the original color of thread. The back of the bodice comes down to a point. It's piped at the lower edge, and it's boned to help hold the point down. And the bone goes up all the way to about here. The silk is unfortunately ripped at the back of the neck. This is a common area of stress where the silk might split, but you can still see the lovely line of the shoulder seam and how low it comes in the back, and how when it meets the sleeve we get a very small little section where the back panel meets. I would guess that the remodeling was done in the early 20th century, maybe the 19-teens or the 1930s, which is when that style of collar was fashionable. It was probably done for some sort of historical pageant, maybe a play. No real way of knowing, but even back then people found that the antique gowns that were still around tended to be way too small to wear. Now let's look at the sleeves. The sleeves are done in two parts, although only one part remains on the left side. We've got this large hanging upper sleeve that's made like the pagoda sleeves of the late 1850s and early 1860s. And then underneath we have a fitted sleeve that sticks out at the wrist. The hanging sleeve is cut on the bias along the back so that in front, one side of the seam has the grain running this way and the other side is on the cross grain. And the sleeves have been left as they were originally, which is very nice for us as we get to see them. The armscye is piped, mandatory for this period. Oh, and I'd also like to point out the enormous sweat stains here. It's possible that these are indicators that the dress was heavily worn back in the 1860s, but I think it's very likely that these actually go along with the other later modifications of the bodice, and that whatever sort of historical pageant it was worn for, the person wearing it got a little sweaty. But anyway, the big hanging sleeve is lined with a lightweight off-white silk taffeta. Please focus, there we go. And then at the edge there's a box pleated ribbon in matching silk. And the interesting thing here is that this ribbon and this braid appear to have been sewn on at the same time with the same thread, which is very efficient, although it seems like it would be a little tricky. The edges of the two layers of silk seem like they've been bag lined. That's a technique where you put your pieces together right side to right side. You sew around the edge, then you turn it right side out and press, and that way you don't have any visible stitching. It's not something people tended to do too much before the sewing machine because it's a little tricky that way, and it's not very efficient, but we certainly have the sewing machine very commonly used in North America by the 1860s, so it's not too surprising. So our fitted sleeve is mostly polished cotton all the way up to the shoulder, and below the elbow it's covered with the brown silk taffeta of the dress. We've even got a little bit of piecing over here. Right here. We've got 2 rows of braid around the edge, which is a nice touch, and a silk facing at the cuff with a tiny little bit of piping on it. The bodice also has a peplum. And we'll see how it's attached in a bit when I get to the interior of the dress. But from the outside you can see that it is made of the same brown silk taffeta and lined with polished cotton. In some places, at these points, it's also faced with silk in case it flipped up, most likely. You want to make sure people don't see that polished cotton like they do right there. This is also bag lined and also trimmed with the silk braid. The back piece is cut on the straight grain, and the side pieces have the front cut on the straight grain and the back is cut on the bias very strongly to help it flare out. The front pieces are also cut on the straight grain. And you can see it's pleated quite a bit at the waist to give it some fullness. And we've got the facing in the front as well. The skirt is very tricky to film. Right now the gown is dressed over my hoop from Catherine Nagy at Originals by Kay. And that shape is a very belled one. It's great for the late 1850s and very early 1860s, but by about 1863 the actual shape of the hoop was usually quite flatter in the front and on the sides particularly, and it was starting to project out in the back. By 1866 and 67, when this gown is from, it was pretty common to have that strong elliptical shape. By 1867, you might even not have a very big hoop, and the dress would actually trail on the ground behind you. This one is cut in gores. So you have the center front is on the straight grain, and then on either side cut at an angle. And each panel that follows will have straight grain here and angle in the back. And that's in order to help it lay flatter against that very flat hoop, which I do not have, although I would like to get one. And the opening to the skirt is right over here, hidden underneath your peplum. Okay, and here we have the inside of the bodice. As you can see, there's a lot going on. Let's start up at the neckline. So the thread that the neckline is finished with is the older color of thread, but you can see that there are stitch holes in there, which makes sense because this is not a normal way to finish necklines and other edges in the 1860s. Normally you would pipe it, so it's most likely that they changed the angle of the neckline. It was probably originally a jewel neckline right around the neck, around the throat, and they changed it to be a nice deep V. You can see the different types of thread that people used when they adapted the braid into a different shape as well. So much going on. They had to take a little bit of a tuck in the lining here on one side in order to deal with a little physical asymmetry, a real mess going on in the arm side there where probably there was some more adaptation. So we've got some boning inside the back, and that's quite interesting because you can see the back is all one piece. These curved side back seams are only in the silk, so they were able to put these bone casings in first and then sew the silk on. You can see we've got a chain stitch in here, so this was done with an old-fashioned chain stitch machine. And you can see the tip of the whalebone at the center back. So this is actual baleen, not steels. And it's sewn on with a black thread that doesn't match at all. And so is the interior waistband, where you can see it here. We've also got some whalebone at the side, and it's broken right about here. We've got our darts that have been very messed with. And in here, so this is especially why you can see that the hooks and eyes have been altered from their original configuration. It was probably originally buttoned or something like that. Anyway, but this kind of twill tape with hooks attached to it is not something that you see in the 1860s. And we have an interior hook and eye closure on a twill tape from the side seams. This is also probably not original, although this may be original. This is the sort of thing that people did in the mid-19th century in order to keep there from being too much pressure on the actual front closure. Oh, and that collar that I said I would come back to, so yeah, this is not original. You can see it's in two pieces. An actual 1860s collar would have been a single piece made with a band on it and basted into the neckline. It would have gone all the way around. This is just costume frippery, which is interesting because you have an actual 1860s dress that somebody feels in probably, 1915 or 1930. This isn't historical enough. I need to make it more historical, and they add on anachronistic things that feel more historical. They feel more authentic. And here's the interior of the peplum. This was probably a totally separate piece at one time. You can see this nice facing here. That was then basted in with that gray thread that's very helpful for telling us that something's been changed. They felt, why should I bother to put on a skirt over my skirt when I can just sew this into the bodice and not have to think about it? Other than that, it really does seem pretty much as it originally was. We had to re-stitch that silk braid on, but other than that, it's really all there. And it's also sewn with that chain stitch machine that we saw on the bodice. And right here on the back piece, you can see that these pleats are actually stitched down through several layers, and that's in that gray thread, so we know that that is not original either. Now let's look at some details on the skirt. So from the outside, it looks like there's a waistband of Petersham or grosgrain ribbon. But when you look to the inside, it's clear that this strip of silk was the original waistband, and the skirt was whipped to it with some nice tiny stitches. And then during that remodeling, oh, see, here's the original hook and eye. During the remodeling, somebody just threw a ribbon down on top and ran it under a machine. So we've got the original big pleats in the front and on the other side. And then at the center back, what originally was gauging, probably, and was taken off the original waistband when it was replaced with this ribbon. So unfortunately, we can't see the original stitches that held the skirt to the waistband in the back, but we can basically guess at them. This is a pretty normal configuration for the period, to have the front pleated to make it flat, and then the back to have all this extra fabric gathered in very closely. And on the wearer's right side of the skirt, we have a pocket. It is not secured really to the silk anymore, but there is a nice pocket of polished cotton. And here on the interior, you can see exactly how big that pocket is. It's quite sizable. People talk a lot about the vanishing of pockets from women's dress, but in reality, pockets did come back after the tie-on pockets disappeared in the 18th century. Because with the return of big full skirts, women had space to put things resting against their hips inside their gowns again. As I noted before, the skirt panels are gored. They're cut with the sides on the bias and at an angle, and so, as often happens with gored skirts, somebody had to piece in a little bit. So this is on the grain and this is on the bias, and it gives you just that little bit of extra width. And at the bottom of the skirt, it's finished with a wool braid. It doesn't quite match, but it's close enough. People didn't really care about whether or not the braid was the exact same color as the silk. There wasn't a sense that it had to be completely disguised, because this is just how you finished a skirt. You can see here that it totally binds the edge. On the inside of the bottom of the skirt, there is a wide piece of very, very light crinoline or buckram. It's just enough to give it a little body, so it doesn't hang limply at the hem. It stands out below the hoops. And that is sewn on with a machine stitch, as you can see, to the lining, but not all the way through to the outside of the skirt. Can't see any stitches there. The way they did this is by facing each panel separately before sewing it together in the dress. And this was very helpful because sometimes you have a panel that you can cut all in one piece in the polished cotton lining, or vice versa. And this makes it just a little bit simpler to have it all add up to the right size. And so this is a seam with the silk, a fully flat-lined seam, whereas down here on the back, this is a seam just in the polished cotton to make it fit the width of the silk. Now at the bottom and back, where we have the train, we also have this dust ruffle. Now this is sewn on with the light colored thread that it seems to be the original thread or the earliest alteration. So this is probably an original dust ruffle when this was worn as perhaps a traveling dress or a walking dress. This is before those pre-made dust ruffles you may have seen on gowns from the 1890s or 1880s, even 1870s, which you could buy just pre-made lengths of and tack it inside the dress. This is a little stiff. It's kind of like a tarlatan, a sized, stiffened cotton, very loose woven, and it's just box pleated pretty roughly and tacked right into the hem in order to keep the skirt itself from getting too dirty. This plate has perhaps the best comparison image for this gown that I can find. It's from Peterson's Magazine, an American publication, and the color plate for November in 1867. From left to right, the third and fifth gowns feature the same paired sleeves. The second from the left is actually a gown worn with a paletot or a coat over it. The third, in the center of the plate, is described as a house dress of Havana brown silk trimmed with ornaments in gimp and jet. The loose Venetian sleeve is lined with quilted white satin and worn over a tight silk undersleeve. And the fifth, on the far right, is described as a morning dress of black velvet scalloped and bound with black satin. Petticoat and tight sleeves of crimson silk. The large Jewess sleeve is also lined with crimson silk. A band of fur passes around the neck down the front and across the top of the sleeves.
The band of fur shows where the braid on the bodice of my gown would probably have been placed originally. Venetian sleeve is a term I've come across for a long hanging sleeve in this and earlier periods, but a Jewess sleeve is a new one to me, and I don't know what distinguishes it from the Venetian. In a previous issue, the editor noted that the wide loose sleeve has not been as much worn during the summer as was expected, and as the autumn approaches, the close sleeve will probably be the most popular. Still, the Jewess sleeve is very suitable for dresses of heavy material and paletos and is by some very much liked. It's a wide open sleeve made round, slightly pointed, and very long. In March, the magazine had stated that over the tight sleeve, the wide Venetian sleeve is frequently worn, and in May, included a house dress of black silk over a blue silk petticoat. The tight sleeves are of blue silk with black lozenges on them, and the loose sleeve is of black lined with blue. Another key aspect of this dress is the peplum or overskirt. Overskirts of one kind or another started to appear in fashion plates in 1865, and by 1866, they're quite common. These two plates from Godey's book in late 1866, here's another one, also show the fitted sleeves that match the shape of the undersleeves here, the natural waistline, and the elliptical shape of the hoop underneath the smooth gored skirt. By 1868, the hoop was shrinking, which helps to set an end date for the original wearing of this dress. Trains went rather out of style in day wear as well, so the skirt simply couldn't be worn fashionably. However, when the bustle began to be worn in late 1869 and into the 1870s, there was new potential for the outfit. A bustle would lift up the back of a long gored skirt, taking up the excess fabric. A narrow V neckline also became acceptable around this time, in day wear. It seems very plausible to me that the bodice could have been altered this way in order to update it, since the way the neckline is finished doesn't seem at all in line with normal 1860s practice, and since normal 1860s day necklines were much higher.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at one of the gems of my collection. I hope to turn this gown into a pattern, reversing those later changes like, the messed up darts and so on, in order to allow people to make it up as it was originally intended to be seen. Although since the V neckline seems to have been an early alteration, I will probably include an option to do that as well. And then you can always use the pattern to make a late 1860s and an early 1870s gown. But anyway, first I have to finish cleaning up the Regency Spencer pattern I have out with testers right now. And I also have a different 1860s pattern to clean up and get to more testers. And then after that, I'm probably going to make a pattern or two from other periods because I try to sort of cycle through things and not get stuck just doing one period over and over. But after then, you will be able to see it someday. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out the others that I have, and please like and subscribe. Join me again next time when I discuss the 2005 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, both in terms of costuming and as film theory, once I figure out how to edit in clips underneath my own audio.